Hi, I'm Kiko Adato, and Michael Sandel and I are coordinating the seminar, international seminar, Art, Political Culture, and Civic Life. Today, we're going to talk about the topic of patriotism and the culture wars. And we have a distinguished member of our group, a founding member and a award-winning writer, Jim Carroll, who writes fiction, nonfiction, and also many columns. And we'll be in dialogue with all of you. We encourage all of you to participate in the discussion. We're going to begin with the question, why is it that in this country, Republicans have been able to capture patriotic symbols, the flag and other symbols, and make it their own? And often Democrats are a little less comfortable or easy with flying the flag and using other patriotic symbols, and look deeper into the meaning of the culture wars that we face. So to begin with, I wanted to speak about how deeply poignant these questions are for Jim and I, because we're both military brats. I grew up in a Army base, and I remember being a 4-year-old little girl running with a pack of kids to go and see the flag being taken down on the military base. This was a significant moment in our day. And Jim, why don't you begin by telling us your memories? Your dad was a member of the U.S. Air Force. You grew up on military bases as well. What was it like when you grew up? What was the feeling of patriotism as a lived experience?
Well, first, Kiko, greetings to you, to Michael, to all of our friends. It's a great pleasure to see your faces, and a great pleasure to be with you all on this important question. Kiko, thanks for that invitation. Indeed, thanks for the honor of kicking off our conversation. I hope to speak not too long, 10 minutes or so, and try to put some questions on the table. Beginning by affirming what you just said, Kiko. My dad, an Air Force officer, I grew up, my most formative experiences took place at Air Force bases in Germany during the post-occupation period in the 1950s, an intensely patriotic moment in American memory. The triumph of World War II still fresh in everyone's consciousness. The great pride we took in being Americans. American triumphalism at its best was the feeling. In my life at Bolling Air Force Base in Washington, where my father spent more than a decade working at the Pentagon. I remember, as I told you once, Kiko, the most solemn moment of the day at Bolling was at about 5 p.m. every day. The loudspeakers posted everywhere in the base began to blare with the playing of taps, which meant that the flag was being lowered from the pole in front of the headquarters building. And everyone was obliged to stop immediately what they were doing. If you were driving, you had to stop the car, get out of the car, stand beside the car. If you were in uniform, salute properly with your hand to your forehead. If you were not in uniform, stand with your hand over your heart. That was a daily ritual, and it was I valued it enormously. It was essential to my identity. And of course that changed. So in a way, I'm exhibit A of the problem, the question that Kiko raised, and you'll see a bit of that. And let me just finally say a last personal note that all of this feeling for our country, from my love of our country, from my love of the flag, reached the climax at my father's funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. And as you know, the American flag is a crucial part of the military funeral. When the flag is precisely folded, removed from the casket, precisely folded, ritually folded, and presented by the senior officer present to the widow of the military person being buried. That flag, a precious, precious emblem of all that was most valuable to us. But even that moment was complicated, and I'll return to it in a moment. I'll return to it. Patriotism and the culture wars. I want to begin by putting a few reflections on the table. First, James Baldwin I love America more than any country in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. Stephen Decatur, the legendary US Navy Commodore of the 18th and early 19th century. Our country, in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but right or wrong, our country. Brittany Griner, who said in 2020, after the George Floyd killing, I honestly feel we should not play the national anthem during our season. I think we should take that much of a stand. I don't mean that in any disrespect, and certainly not disrespect to our country. My dad was in Vietnam and a law officer for 30 years. I wanted to be a cop before basketball. I do have pride for my country. And finally, a bumper sticker that was a defining emblem of the early 1970s in the United States. America, love it or leave it. We saw it everywhere. There's a basic question embedded in these statements, and it's embedded really in the conversation we're about to have. And here it is. Is self-criticism equivalent to self-hatred? It's a question for national communities, but it's also a question for every community. I ask it also as a Roman Catholic who has also struggled to learn how to be a self-critically religious person. The issue arises powerfully around the symbols we associate with our communities. And that's obvious in the way in which Kiku introduced our conversation by drawing our attention to the powerful symbol of the flag, the national anthem, athletes who refuse to stand respectfully while it's sung. The idea of exceptionalism, is it unpatriotic to question the idea of American exceptionalism, as President Obama was accused of being when he suggested that every nation thinks of itself as exceptional? The Constitution itself as a symbol of our nation. Our public officials swear to uphold the Constitution, even as we live in a time when the Constitution itself is being reckoned with as having been complicit in the upholding of slavery and having been complicit in the upholding, making permanent other forms of American inequality. The idea of 1776 as a sacred date, shadowed, shade cast upon it lately by the idea of 1619, prompting groups like the so-called Mothers of Liberty to patrol the ways in which schools and libraries participate in what's notoriously referred to as critical race theory. Do we confuse the symbol for the reality when the symbols become contentious? I want to just step back for a moment and think about what the culture wars actually refer to, that phrase culture wars. We think we know what it refers to, but it may be a little more complicated than we normally think. I can list, thinking with an eye cast back over American history, several sets of culture wars. Briefly, settlers versus the original peoples, white Europeans versus kidnapped Africans, the agrarian South versus the industrial North, rural regions of the United States versus urban centers, the coastal elites versus interior common people, the heterogeneity of seaboard cities and settlements versus the much more homogeneous character of communities in the interior, the secular versus the religious, or among the religious, the ecumenical religious versus the evangelical religious. All of these clear instances of culture war raise deeper questions that are embedded in our conversation. The educated versus the less educated. Seeds of the culture war sown, perhaps, for example, by the Land-Grant College Act of 1863, which provided federal support for higher education, but only in the North, not in the South. What does that legacy suggest about the culture wars? Questions of the scientific method versus impulses to accept untested assumptions. Values embedded in the so-called Enlightenment versus the tradition. A perspective that values the universal over the particular. That great, permanent human question. The very meaning of symbols. What are symbols to us? The chart is not the sea. They remind us when we're on a boat that's just run aground. The chart, the symbol of the bottom of the sea, but it's not the sea. Does a symbol participate? In what way does it participate in the reality that is symbolized? A question powerfully asked, raised by the status of the flag. The liberal imagination, which is in some way inevitably a demythologizing imagination. Historical consciousness versus what you might call originalism. All of these basic questions are human questions, and there are versions of them endemic to every culture and community. But our discussion today is actually a discussion about what happened when these basic human questions were ignited, weaponized by a particular moment and a particular subgroup of our community, of our national community. And I'm referring now to the way in which the Republican Party deliberately and quite consciously and for political purposes weaponized these basic human divisions. And of course, I'm talking about the moment when that happened, which was very much associated with the period of the Vietnam War. Normal human tensions became instances of the full-bore culture war that we're living with today. Before Vietnam, these divisions, versions of which I just laid out, were experienced as contested, but they were not contested in a particularly partisan way. Democrats and Republicans found themselves on both sides of many of these questions. In the Cold War before Vietnam, there was a powerful American consensus. It's true that many people were marginal to it or excluded, not the least African Americans and people of other minorities. But there was a powerful national consensus, probably supported mostly by the Manichaean dread that defined our contest with communism. But something different happened during Vietnam. It's not an accident that, of course, that I'm talking about in my own story, just when I happened to come of age. In 1972, another flag was unveiled, a flag that stands now in the shadow of, but powerfully accompanying, often if not almost always, the American flag. And I'm talking about, you know this, the POW MIA flag. It was devised by a group called the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. You are not forgotten. And indeed they aren't. The odd thing about this flag, rarely discussed and not much noticed, is despite it's not being noticed, it's pretty much everywhere. In fact, that's what makes it so unnotable. This flag flies in front of post offices, schools, Legion halls, but not just those. It flies over the White House. It flies over Fenway Park. It flies everywhere in America. And this is 50 years after the critical question that gave rise to it was resolved. In 1973, with the conclusion of the treaty between the United States and the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, 600 prisoners of war were returned, including John McCain. The American defeat in that war immediately generated enormous psychological, emotional stresses in us as a people. And one of the ways in which it immediately began to be expressed, that trauma, was the creation of a myth about a vast number of Americans who'd been left behind in POW camps, the missing Americans. At that point, there were about 2,000 officially listed missing Americans, and they haunted their families. The tragic truth is that almost all, and effectively all, of the missing Americans were dead. And the number of missing was so high, in part for the very human and in a way noble reason that many Americans who went missing were actually quite clearly killed. But if they were reported as missing instead of dead, their widows at home continued to get their full salaries and benefits. So an Air Force or a Navy pilot would see his wingman, the plane next to him in the formation of a bombing run, would see that plane shot down and crashed, what might even see the pilot parachute out of it with a lifeless body. When that airman returned to the base, he would report that he saw his fellow pilot alive, so that he would be reported as missing instead of dead. This happened dozens, if not hundreds of times. It was a kind of tradition among the flyers, a way to make sure that the families of those flyers were cared for. And so for years after that incident, those men's families continued to be the beneficiaries of salaries and benefits. The men were dead. The widows were given reason to hope they were alive. It's a kind of tragic generating of what became a kind of haunting of the American imagination. The myth of the missing men generated in America a feeling of victimhood, that the war that we had just lost was a war in which we, the Americans, were the victims. You will not be forgotten. The way in which that image and then that problem continued across the next 2.5 decades was defining for the culture war we're talking about now. Because Republican politicians, especially beginning with Ronald Reagan, but not just him, George H.W. Bush, Robert Dole, George W. Bush, Gerald Ford even, Republican politicians weaponized the myth of the missing men as a way of generating a new political movement. You remember it, some of you remember it, the Rambo movies, the idea that there were these men, Americans, held in jungle cages. It wasn't true. It finally was resolved only because of the valiant efforts of John McCain himself, who with John Kerry led a Senate congressional investigation into the missing to establish the fact 25 years later that there were no missing Americans. There were no men left behind. There were none who had been forgotten. But by then, the normalization of relations with Vietnam, which didn't take place until 1995, by then, the United States of America had cast itself as the main victim of that war. That victimization became a note of American patriotism, and that's part of the legacy we're trying to reckon with here. What does it amount to? The absolute forbidding of self-criticism. We couldn't be critical of the war in Vietnam as long as we were the victims of it. A 20-year war followed the catastrophe of 9/11. The victimization of the American imagination after Vietnam was the preparation for the way in which we regarded ourselves as a victimized people again after the assaults of 9/11, which led to the 20-year-long war in Afghanistan and the countries that were into which that war spilled. For 20 years, we waged a war without thinking critically about it as a people. It began as, of course, as you know, with the Congressional Revolution that every member of the House of Representatives voted for, except for Barbara Lee. Why was it that we as a people looked the other way for 2 decades as that war unfolded, until we had to look at it directly for a moment a year ago, last August? Patriotism with an element of victimization made self-criticism impossible. I said a minute ago that I'd return to Arlington National Cemetery. As it happened, we buried my father on the very day that the first Gulf War began in January of 1991. By then I had redefined myself. My patriotism included a strong note of anti-war commitment. But that day, as I listened to taps and watched the flag being folded and stood there looking out over the fields of thousands of American heroes, I was very much in touch, not only with my deep love for this country, but my appreciation for all the people that have defined themselves by their patriotic feelings for it. But at that very moment, for me, the complication was that an anti-war demonstration that I had actually helped to organize was unfolding across the river in Washington. I was in 2 places at once that day. And here's my final thought. The culture wars that we're talking about, right versus left, now purple versus blue, Democrats versus Republicans, these culture wars are not the product of what has given us Donald Trump and all that comes in the train of his movement. The culture wars live in all of us. I myself experienced the division. I myself, the boy standing beside an automobile while taps is played, while the flag is lowered. And also the appalled witness as I see savagely violent fanatics storming the US Capitol, using the flag as a kind of grotesquely, sacrilegiously abused symbol of contempt for the United States of America. And even as I hear Donald Trump declare the time of termination for the US Constitution, which remains in a sense the most unassailed symbol of our nation, I recognize all of this in myself. The culture wars that have become so savage and so dangerous for democracy.
Thank you, Jim. That was a beautifully eloquent opening to our discussion. And I wanted to call upon Michael first for a comment, and then we'll expand the dialogue.
Well, Jim, these were such powerful, moving reflections to start us off. The question I thought I was going to ask you, Jim, and it's a question also for Kiku, because I have in my mind these two images of the two of you as kids, thrilling to or being moved by the playing of taps and the lowering of the flag on your respective families' army bases. The question I was going to ask, whether in retrospect, you see this childhood patriotism as a form of false consciousness, or as a sentiment you would affirm. And Jim, I take it your answer is, well, that you have an ambivalent relation to that image. You don't see it as false consciousness, if I hear you right. You want to make it compatible with, you want to enable it to live with the capacity for self-criticism and protest and dissent. But you, at the same time, want to affirm it. Is that right? Do I have you right?
Well, yes, and I want to, I associate myself with what James Baldwin said. I love my country, and I love it, and I see its exceptional character, and its embrace of the ideals of liberal democracy. But of course, it's because of the it's because of what America has put before me that I criticize it.
Right.
That's the point of it. America has made me a liberal Democrat, which includes an essential note of self-criticism. And of course, you can see that in the way in which our country has unfolded over the centuries, the ways in which the definition of liberty and equality have been constantly in progressive, constantly in being reshaped and reformed. So there's a revolutionary note built into this country that that's what I love. But of course, it is ambivalent. My country, right or wrong? No, my country, right or wrong, make it right, challenge what's wrong about it. America, love it or leave it? No. America, love it by not leaving it.
Okay, but then I want to ask a follow-up. I see the force of that, and I suspect Kiku agrees with that formulation.
Not quite. I mean, I agree
well,
with
go ahead. Go ahead.
I agree with everything that Jim said in terms of the profound love of country means that you can also be a patriot and a critic at the same time. In fact, it's an obligation, I would say, of patriotism to criticize in the sense of trying to make your country better. And I remember earlier in our group, Aaron had read the Langston Hughes poem, America is Not America to Me. And he speaks about the America that will be. You have to bring into being. It isn't a simple criticism of a carping. It's a transformative criticism in which you are trying to ask our country to live up to its principles and its Republican small r values. But when I'm thinking back on the flag, growing up, and this is something that Jim and I have talked about, is the flag was a sacred symbol. It meant life and it meant death. As Jim said, the flags drape the coffin. The flag is treated as a sacred symbol. It can't touch the ground. It's the social theorists, anthropologist Emile Durkheim talks about how you need symbols, signs, icons to represent the group, and not just represent the group, but kind of bring the group into being. And so in one sense, the flag on the military base meant the whole cycle of life and death, of sacrifice. It wasn't an empty flag waving. It wasn't flag pin wearing. It was a sense of this deeper community. And I'm also recalling such the wonderful beginning of the 1619 project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, where she begins talking about how her dad was born and raised in Mississippi. She and the family grew up in Iowa, and her dad, who'd served in the US military, proudly flew the flag. Even if the porch needed painting, the flag was always pristine. And as she was growing up, she's thinking, why? Why, given racism, segregation, all the problems of this country, deep-seated problems, why is he flying the flag? But after doing the research on the 1619 project, she realized the meaning of that, because she makes the very powerful point, which Frederick Douglass also makes in his speech about the 4th of July, that Black people, African Americans, helped build this country. This is their country. Build it, and not in terms of creating its riches and building its structures, but contributing culturally, politically, the whole period of Reconstruction, the laws that emerged, the amendments after the Civil War. All of these things were profound contributions to democracy. So when I think of the flag in that way, I never think of it as a false consciousness, but rather taking it into a very secular, or Jim would say profane way, to profane the flag, not to have it as an emblem of unity, but as Jim has pointed out, and which is just troubling, and we want to put it before the group again, why has the Republican Party captured the flag? And why is it that many Democrats don't fly it? And I wanted to call on just first Erica and then Felix. Erica lives in Georgia, just to talk about the recent campaign and who's flying the flag and who isn't.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I am from the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, and recently, as you all know, there was the runoff election between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. And just to give a little observation of what goes on in my neighborhood, I'm driving down the neighborhood and I see kind of who puts up the American flag and who doesn't. And I've noticed that every time I see the American flag, there's a strong association with Herschel Walker, Brian Kemp, in those houses. And then when I see signs for Raphael Warnock or Stacey Abrams, for example, there's a complete there's an absence of an American flag. So I do see kind of in my own life and everyday life how the far right or conservative or Republican parties have kind of used the American flag as a symbol that represents, association with those kinds of ideals. And especially in the midst of a really intense runoff election, I noticed that the flags were coming out way more often. They were flown higher, they were put right in the front of their yards. Whereas people I've noticed who supported Raphael Warnock or parties that lean towards the left, there's been less of a, I'm trying to figure out the right way to describe it. There's less of an emphasis or use of the symbol of the American flag. So definitely a very interesting observation with the recent election.
And do you think that's a mistake? Why aren't Democrats flying the flag? Why cede that ground of such a potent symbol? And when Jim was speaking so eloquently of the experience of growing up on a military base, the flag is much more resonant of unity. Why do you think Democrats cede that ground?
I'm also thinking because of the recent events, especially with January 6th and how the American flag was kind of used as a way to literally represent movement and like destroying the Capitol and destroying all the ideals that initially when the creation of the country was built, ideas of unity, togetherness, I think because of the way, kind of like Jim was saying, presidents and other political officials that lean Republican or lean to the right have kind of formed this rhetoric about the flag. And so I'm questioning why Democrats want to use it is because it's so associated with that strong sense of separation, of violence, of myth. And I think that, especially in my situation, I have family members who are veterans. My great grandfather, he had the same American flag on his coffin. And I think about that all the time, but I think it's just a strong rhetoric associated with violence, with separation. And there's a fear associated with kind of using the American flag. Yeah, I can't lie. Sometimes when I drive around my neighborhood in Atlanta and I see the American flag held high, there's an amount of fear or anxiety that I get, especially when seeing signs of political officials that may not support my identity or may not support my lifestyle associated with racism, segregation, so many different ideals. And I think there's been a separation kind of between the symbol and its meaning, where the American flag is intended to represent, togetherness, liberation, revolution, freedom, but it's turned into something that's completely separated from its original intentions. So yeah, I think that's why, just the strong rhetoric, the strong message that's been reinforced over and over again by political officials that lean towards the right, which make it sometimes makes people feel like they're not necessarily worthy enough to use the American flag, but they're not in the right or don't believe the right ideals or associate with the stereotypical American ideology that the right has, taken over. So I think that's why Democrats don't really use the flag much.
And Felix, in your neighborhood and others contribute as
And
well.
Felix is going to tell us about his.
Definitely. So I'm from Los Angeles, specifically the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. So it's a very big place, very liberal as well. And I must say, I do not see the American flag unless it's at a school, unless it's at a government building. It's very rare, at least where I live, to see it on patios, to see it at houses. And when you do, and when I do drive around the area, you can tell which neighborhoods tend to be more conservative based on the amount of American flags on the patio of the houses. Which I think is, an unfortunate situation, but it's just the reality. And also, if you put a bumper sticker of an American flag on your car, like there's many ways you can signpost that you are conservative in a way that just uses the flag in such an interesting way, at least where I'm from. And I don't want to change the subject too drastically, but I also think that it's an interesting idea to think about sporting events. And especially now with the World Cup going on, I've been seeing exponentially more American flags. People are wearing them on their shoulders during game days. If you go to the places that are watching it together, you hear the USA chant that you never ever hear in other circumstances. And I always think about what's the difference here? Why are we hearing it in these cases? Is it so just removed from politics entirely that people have decided that it's okay to collectively use this symbol? Just because their jerseys are the same colors, or that, before the game starts, you sing the national anthem in such a way. I do find it a very unifying experience in a way that uses that symbol. And there is no other media or another event like an Olympics or in a World Cup that uses the flag in such a way. So I'm curious to hear what other people think about that as well.
If possible, I'd like to just slightly challenge the narrative originally presented by Kiku, and Kiku will forgive me for that.
Mhm.
The idea of at least Trump voters or Trump kind of conservatives appropriating patriotism. I believe that they do appropriate the symbols, but I don't believe they're patriotic. In fact, I think that neither Trump right-wingers nor liberals are patriotic these days. And because I believe that they both identify patriotism with nationalism. And I think that the two things are mutually exclusive in a way. Because I think one way to describe them could be simply patriotism is love for country and its ideals, and nationalism is love for nation, for one's nation. But I think that instead patriotism is a kind of love, and it's a kind of true love that stems from an idea of giftedness, of humility, even of shame and guilt for one's wrongs or for one's country's wrongs, or it stems also from the fact that we are aware of our own guilts or our own sinfulness and undeservingness. Nationalism, instead, I don't think is a form of love. I think it's a pathological obsession with an idea of a nation that stems from a sense of superiority, not humility and shame and guilt, but an idea of being more, better, superior than others. And so associated with that distinction, I think especially on the left, you could say, well, the left could rethink patriotism by refocusing the symbols over the notion of shame and guilt, because there's a lot of talk on the left, on the liberal left, about the shame and guilt for our past. But I think the liberal discourse over shame and guilt is itself uncritical, because rather than understanding shame and guilt as deriving from our sinfulness, it simply depicts past wrongs as something that can never be atoned for. And so I think ultimately to regain a sense of patriotism understood in this sense that I'm proposing, we need an idea of the sacred. We need an idea of the sacred that itself requires a conception of ourselves as sinful.
This is all so fascinating, and just two comments. One is that sort of the dean of American painters, Jasper Johns, had the creation of the American flag as one of his iconic works that he started. He did his first flag in the early 50s, but he continued making flags throughout his career. He never talked about it as a political symbol, but rather that it was put out there for you to react to it. He was recreating it over and over again to interact with the viewer. But it's interesting to me in this discussion that, you know, one of the most accomplished and now very senior American painters chose that as a medium in which to express himself to his public. The other thing is that I wanted to comment on related to Erica's comments about the flag in Atlanta, and also Jim's thesis. I think there's another underlying stream in all of this, and that is the need for a common enemy. And the arts community in America really became the common enemy after the fall of communism. And that as one of the people in the trenches in this, in my career, the virulent nature with which certain senators and congressmen and also NGO leaders like Ralph Reed and his Family Values organization attacked American artists, particularly lesbian, homosexual, trans artists, and just went after eviscerating their careers. The anger and the aggressiveness of it was just it was really hard to deal with. And if you were on the ground in a community and you had an exhibition to defend, you had so much work to do to just hope that your community leaders didn't turn against you because of this wind coming out of Washington and elsewhere. And in fact, this was so intense that, as you may recall, a museum leader in Cincinnati was actually jailed over an exhibition by Mapplethorpe. So these battles had many effects, I think, on continuing the divisions in the country, because the arts programming nationally had really begun to flourish in the 60s and become a national movement with festivals, theater, touring, the division of the country into regions that actually produced and transported performing arts works. And what this did was absolutely desiccated the National Funding Agency. The National Endowment for the Arts is a shell of its former self, no longer a leader in providing inspiration, vision, or funding to the arts in America. It started out, it was created at the same time as the National Science Foundation. Well, the National Science Foundation is now a multi-billion-dollar agency, not without its problems as well, but the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts is hovering around 140 million, which was what it was back in the early 70s. And so this attack on making the arts the enemy has had the effect of lessening the communication among all of us in local arts activities that once were building a vibrant presence in festivals and et cetera, and have really shrunk in their capacity to exist. So I think this need for communism as a force to battle against got turned on the arts community in America.
It's fascinating. That's fascinating, and really such an interesting take on this. Kiku, could I pick up on a point that Sergio made in the form of a question to Jim?
Yes, please.
Sergio argued that patriotism, unlike nationalism, patriotism is a kind of love for country that presupposes a conception of the sacred. And I'd like to put, Jim, this question to you. You said something in passing in your opening remarks that I found fascinating, and I don't want to let us lose track of it. You said that the liberal imagination is a demythologizing imagination. My question is this, Jim: is this a strength of liberalism because its demythologizing impulse creates space for self-criticism? Or is it a weakness because the demythologizing impulse of liberalism drives out the sacred?
Well, it's a really important question, Michael. I wish I was a wise person enough to give a good, strong, lucid answer, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking. It depends on the state of human threat. If we're afraid for our lives and we believe that our lives depend on the literal truth of our myths, then we cannot be self-critical about our myths. I mean, that's why war is so damaging. War is what turns patriots into nationalists, to follow up on Sergio's useful distinction. War is so damaging because when it comes to survival, we human beings believe we cannot afford to be self-critical. Self-criticism feels like self-doubt, and at the crucial moment, that's what gets you killed. And I think that's part of why, you know, when war became the defining experience of the 20th century, so many of these issues overwhelmed our capacity to deal with them humanely. The liberal imagination is self-critical by definition. The Enlightenment, as I understand it, is a moment when human beings understood the importance of thinking twice of submitting beliefs to the test of experience, the coming of the scientific method, all of that. We don't take for granted our assumptions, but when you're going into battle, you have to take them for granted. You can't be thinking about them. I mean, that's what's so damaging about battle. And that's why in the story of the United States, our horrible experiences of war, both as perpetrators and as victims, have really traumatized us. We're all suffering from a kind of ongoing PTSD. And the liberal imagination does not survive in a period of post-traumatic stress. That's the problem we're living through now. The liberal imagination is what's in jeopardy in the United States and in the West generally. And I think it's a function of our unexamined and uncriticized national ethos, mythology, if you want. So the liberal imagination, I do believe by definition, thinks critically about myths. Human beings are the creatures who create myths and then forget that they're created. That's who we are. We create myths and then we forget that they're created. The liberal imagination remembers that our myths are created and therefore subject to revision or even deletion. And some of our myths in America need to be deleted. The myth of white supremacy, for starters, the myth of male supremacy. These myths need to be criticized and overcome. And that's the function of liberal democratic imagination.
What's interesting, Jim, is she pointed out that this aspect of the liberal imagination of demythologizing, you still want to retain some sense of the sacred, that the myths and mistakes have to be debunked, but not completely strip the public square of any sacred meaning or religious conviction. So the iconoclasm of liberalism, because liberalism and post-enlightenment thinking is very iconoclastic and demythologizing. Now that can be taken, I think, too far, and I'm interested in what other people think in the group, to the extent that you think that symbols don't matter. They're just symbols. They're just constructed. And therefore, when people from different political positions, say in this country, Trump and his supporters or people on the right historically wave the flag, I think it's important to realize that that's capturing something for the wrong purposes. It's stripping it of its unifying and sacred meaning, but that it does have potent meaning. And that's what I'm always curious about, how we address that, because I still go back to the question, are Democrats making a mistake not flying the flag too, just because your opponents fly, where the, as Erica was saying in Georgia, just because the Walker people fly those flags high in their lawns, why is it that the Warnock people, the Democrats, don't fly their flags? Or in the case of Brazil, which I've been following, that Bolsonaro and his supporters have now appropriated the yellow jersey of their famous football team as a right-wing symbol, as a Bolsonaro symbol. Erica will show us a couple of slides. There's Bolsonaro in the center with the yellow shirts, and then there's another slide where you just see the sea of yellow shirts, and Bolsonaro, like Trump, appropriates the flag, and in this case, Erica, we can return to the speaker view, these general symbols, and there's an appropriation. And the president-elect Lula, one of his responses was, just wear them ourselves. Why don't we wear the yellow jersey? It turned out people had a lot of trouble for the reason that Erica and other people have pointed out. It's hard to wear the yellow jersey, or it's hard to hoist up the American flag if your opponents have captured it in some way, captured its meaning. But rhetorically, I'm still baffled. I'm still thinking, maybe going back to being a military brat, this symbol meant something. Why give up on it? Why not take it back as well? Why not try to make it more of a unifying symbol? And that's because of the belief that I hold strongly that these symbols, on the one hand, it's an icon. It's not the real thing, as Jim said, the chart is different than the sea. The map is different than the world, we inhabit. But on another hand, the symbol is so charged, so resonant with meaning. I feel like I want to take it back. I don't want the other side to win and capture the flag.
Gwen has her hand up. Gwen, what do you think?
Oh, well, I just love hearing all you Americans speak so movingly and eloquently about the flag, because in England we're really very much, well, we're squeamish about the flag. We don't really talk or think much about the flag. I mean, the last night of the proms, people waved the flag, and but really, on the whole, the flag isn't part of national life, I guess. So I think we've got to think about the flag and the national anthem as language, and there's a constant battle to claim and redefine and use language by people who have different views. And once you've got the kind of culture wars you have there, we're behind you, thank God. But politics is so tribal, and it comes as a big package of things. So it's not about thinking, it's about belonging, isn't it? It's because it's tribal. So you have a whole package of things you assume go with the different tribes. Now, of course, Kiku and Jim they're breaking, if the flag's going with one tribe, you're refusing to accept that. And there's so many things that are bundled together that aren't really, I mean, you can hold a lot of different views which don't fit you easily into these tribes, which is obviously what we should be trying to pull them apart. But it's immensely difficult. I mean, certainly on the left here, I'm just trying to think about it as you talk. I mean, there has been an attempt. I mean, Keir Starmer for the Labour Party, for the first time, they sang the national anthem at the Labour Party conference. Well, it made the news, because it's just so unusual. And a friend of ours actually was part of the Blair government and given the job of sort of promoting Britishness, as it were. And again, it was very sort of, it never really took off. It never really worked. But again, there's so many ideas come to mind from what you've been saying, thinking about the sport thing at the moment, how incredibly brave the Iranians were to refuse to sing their national anthem. It was, all the other political gestures felt rather empty, but that one, because obviously you think they'd go back and they'd have to experience the power of the state. So there's a power associated as well with the flag, the power of the state. And I suppose it depends on us as a skeptical, questioning liberals who care about being proper patriotic citizens to make it clear that we have as much right to the power of the state as anyone. Anyway, just a few random thoughts, but what a really fascinating.
I admire so much what everybody has said, and Jim's opening remarks were really leave me in awe. I wonder, he mentioned Brittany Griner, Trump's latest lie, which was just this morning, said that Brittany Griner hates America. And of course, she herself has said exactly the opposite. Anyway, I'd kind of like to ask a question of of everyone, of Jim and maybe especially Erica, since all she talked about was the what she talked about was the who flies the flag in Georgia. Well, do you maybe feel that it is time for us to recapture the flag? And I really liked what both Sergio said and Jim following up, saying that once you go to war, patriotism slides right into nationalism, and we start to hate everybody else. And that's when we think of ourselves as more exceptional. We are the exceptional country. And so, Erica, is it time? I mean, I'd like to see us fly the flag again. I think we're more patriotic than they are. They tend to be nationalists. And I think we're more patriotic. So anyway, what do you think about that? Erica, Jim, anybody?
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for that question. I do think yes, but I think it will take time. I think it will take time. It will require a lot of conversations, and going back to Sergio's point about like atonement of sins. I think that is one of the big hurdles kind of that we have to face before we take that symbol back. I think there's a lot of pain and hurt as of recently in associated with the American flag. So some of the problems of like racism, reparations, for example, all of these kind of questions that we've talked about, but we haven't really made, in my opinion, made concrete steps to like fix or atone for the sins of our history. And I do think that, yes, like in the creation of the American flag, like it was a symbol of unity, it was a symbol of freedom, which is what I think that, you know, we all represent. And I think that especially on the left, like active criticism, constantly thinking about, you know, how can we make the country a better place? I think that's like the pinnacle of patriotism. I think that I do agree with you. I think that we should fly the flag, but I think there's been a degree of separation between kind of what the flag has represented in its ideal sense and kind of how it's represented now in a more contemporary sense. I think there's a separation between those two, and kind of in between those there's some conversations that we have that have not been had fruitfully, and where people feel like, you know, they feel comfortable being a patriot, they feel comfortable saying that they are American or they feel like they belong in the country. So I think that once those steps are taken, oh, for sure, 100%. I just think it will take time to kind of think about and remediate the deep pain and kind of, like Jim said, the trauma, the PTSD that certain groups in this country have experienced. And I think about it all the time, like with my own family. I have a lot of veterans, a lot of people who have fought for the country. And every time I think back to them and what they represented and what they did for the country, of course, I'm like, yeah, I should hang the flag and wear it proudly because of kind of what my family and what people close to me have done for the betterment of this country. But also when I look at the flag, I can't help but think about kind of the problems and the pain and the sadness that I too have experienced because of it. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying yes, but it will definitely take some time. And I'm very curious to see what Jim has to say about it too.
Jim.
Well, thanks for that powerful thought, Erica. I think we should fly the flag, we liberals, we of the left, but not the way they do. There's the point. I didn't say it clearly enough. The Republicans profaned the flag and all that it means quite deliberately and for base political motives around the time and towards the end of the Vietnam War. Something happened that was new. And there is a question of the sacred. The sacred points beyond human experience to something that transcends it. And when we turn human experience into the transcendent thing itself, we're committing the sin of idolatry. The right wing, the Republicans, have made the flag and all that it invokes a kind of idolatry. And we should not embrace that idolatry. And the key issue is self-criticism. If the flag is a block, an obstacle to self-criticism, it's an idol, and it should be smashed. We should be iconoclasts about it, the smashing of idols. When an idol is a created thing that claims to be God or is treated as God. And for me, the symbol of this was that moment after 9/11 when we liberals did fly the flag. You remember, those of you who are old enough to remember 9/11, for weeks and months after 9/11, the flag was everywhere. It was in those liberal suburbs too, Erica. Even, I'll bet you, there were flags all over the place in the places in California. Everybody had flags on their car. Why? We were exempt from self-criticism. What did we do? We made the most grievous mistake in some ways, of American history. We embraced a war that was savage beyond our reckoning, even to this day. We embraced it for the wrong reason, and we've been lying to ourselves about it ever since. And the savage end of the war in Afghanistan in August, year before last, we glimpsed it, but we haven't reckoned with it. And that came out of an American refusal to think self-critically after the assault on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. We betrayed ourselves. We betrayed our own liberal values. We went to war, and we wrapped ourselves in the flag, all of us. Not quite all of us, most of us.
Kiku, maybe here's a point to take up Gwen's challenge to the group. Do you see the question Gwen has put to us all in the chat? Who here would be comfortable flying their national flag at their homes?
Yeah, let's take a poll.
So everyone who would raise your hand, either physically or with the marker.
And Michael will do a count.
I see just 5. No, more are going up. More are going up. 3, 4, 5, 6. About 1/3 of the 1/3 of the group. 1/3 of the group.
Michael, I'd like to turn the topic a little. It's another aspect of patriotic symbols, and since people are coming in from all over the world and also representing, different countries, I wanted to turn to Adriana because it's interesting to see the transformation of patriotic symbols. In other words, there's one in the US, we have this constancy with the American flag, but we know that holidays, for example, are changing. That Columbus Day is changing and being renamed now for some years as Indigenous Peoples Day. In the case of Mexico, give us some examples of once patriotic unifying holidays or symbols that then had their meanings remade. And is that one pathway we can think about moving beyond the culture war view of patriotism and more in the restorative or looking at questions of justice and restoration in which patriotism can be imbued with new meaning by renaming or rethinking?
That's a complicated question, Kiku, because in Mexico, I think like everywhere, I've been thinking hard. I've been listening very attentively, and I really appreciate everyone's comments because for me, the American flag is not quite the same as for James and for Kiku. For me, the American flag was the symbol of American imperialism. And from a very early on, it was like a threatening symbol. One of the early images that I have in childhood was the killing of high schoolers in Panama City when they tried to bring down the American flag and flag and put up the Panamanian flag. So that was I'm seeing it from the other side. I'm seeing, like Erica, every time that I see a flag, I try not to go there because it's not an inclusive flag. It really means the state, the American state. So whoever belongs to that state can put the meaning into the flag. For those of us who have traditionally been left out of the comfort and the protection of that state, may not be a comforting symbol. So, but this is a very personal view. But in the case of Mexico, and I was thinking of Brazil and Spain, the flag has also turned into a right-wing symbol. And it is very, it is true that it has to do with the sins or the essentialist foundation of states. It has to do with what Sergio calls nationalism. Nationalism is an essence of a tribe, of a people. So you have to belong to a certain ethnic group or to a certain racial group or to a certain X group. And that is problematic for those who do not belong. So there have been attempts in Mexico, the Dia de la Raza, the Hispanic celebration of identity, was celebrated throughout my high school. And that meant an alignment of Mexicans with Spain and with the traditions of being Hispanic and with speaking Spanish. But of course, as other groups, especially indigenous groups, started claiming their stake at being Mexican, those have also tried to, that national holiday is gone now. And Indigenous Peoples' Days is more celebrated, and the Mexican state has made an attempt to become more inclusive to those groups. But still, it's very hard without what Erica called atonement of sins. If the state is not, if people don't feel reflected in the state, the symbols will not represent them. And that's why I think now has become, I love the notion of idolatry that Jim has put up, because it is true. It's the kind of idolatry that brings that now the flag is short for being right wing. So the left can reclaim it, but it will have to do more than fly it. It will have to reinvent what that flag means and for whom. And I think that's a challenge in such a polarized society.
Because it's a great point, Adriana, because it's the reinvention of meaning, and to get the principles the flag should be standing for in terms of justice for all, and the question of atonement for the sins of the past, all can be incorporated. Ties closely with what Jim was saying about criticism. I saw that Ricardo's hand was up too. So Ricardo, a comment?
Oh, yes, thank you, Kiko, thank you all. I want to absolutely agree with Adriana. In Spain today, and for many, many years, the national flag is considered by many to be the nationalist flag, but even farther, the fascist flag. I would not fly the Spanish flag in Spain, precisely for those reasons. Many people still on the left or far left fly the Republican flag, which is slightly different. And only, like Phyllis said, which is kind of interesting, during the World Cup events, everybody flies the national flag as today, but they don't last. I think it's very much still associated, like in Brazil, like even in Argentina, I believe, in some countries, the national flag is associated with the military, with the coup, with the fascists. But it is interesting when I've been living in the US for more than half of my life. Here, I am not concerned or afraid, and the Spanish flag has a different meaning to me. It's the patriotic meaning. So somehow my mind changed when I'm here, and I am not afraid to, or I'm not concerned about displaying the national flag. But in Spain, I would be. The same thing happens the other way. Like Adriana, in my youth, I always consider the American flag to be the imperialistic flag. Not for the same reasons, but still. When I am in Spain, I look at the American flag with love, because my life is also here, and with a lot of meaning that it didn't have before. So I think every personal experience makes us think in a different way regarding the flag. I agree the right and the extreme right has kidnapped the Spanish flag, the same as they have kidnapped the American flag. And I agree, those are not patriots, they are nationalists. I think we as patriots need to reclaim and regain and get back our flags. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo. We haven't heard from some of our members. I know Michelle Caplet, you had your hand up before. Did you want to comment on any aspect of the discussion so far?
We were struck by the conversation on whether you would fly the American flag in front of your own home, which we have been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. Yeah. And the reason we were inspired by our neighbor was the very issue that we've been talking about, is reclaiming it. Our neighbor was upset with the notion that it had been claimed by the right wing and the Trumpists. So she decided to fly the flag. And so we decided to also, because it seemed like a really good idea. And so we have done that and are very comfortable with it. And other neighbors have done it as well. And this is not a conservative neighborhood by any means. So just wanted to share that. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, so I'll add too, because can you hear me?
Yes.
I really appreciated what Adriana said, because I think I think the flag has so many meanings for so many different people. I've had liberal friends say, you're flying the flag. And so it generates conversations, because I think I've been trying to think about, okay, so how do I make sure that people don't think I'm just another Trumpster out there? And do I fly, a Black Lives Matter flag? But it's like, I don't want to add to another polarization either. It's like, how do I get to a point where we can have a conversation? And so liberal friends talk to me about, why are you flying the flag? And it gives us a chance to have a conversation. I think Michelle's family comes from Texas, and they're
some of them,
and they're Trumpsters, and so they have a different meaning when they see the flag, and so then they have another conversation with us about so I think it allows us to engage in what it might mean in a way that might not have happened if we didn't fly the flag.
In earlier cultural battles, there was richer language in which to fight those battles out, fight not in the militarist sense, but actually to dialogically engage with others. And that's for a lot of reasons, some of which are obvious. Much simpler country, the Constitution these things seem to work. But at a certain point now, we see that it's a complete breakdown. Enter a question Michael raised about false consciousness, or is this something that we could put together about our view of America? Where I'm at now, and I grew up similarly but different from Kiku and you, Jim. I'm not a military brat, that's for sure. But I grew up in a community and went to a public school system where patriotism in very thick ways, the flag, the Pledge of Allegiance. We actually in 5th grade used to all meet outside of the school to bring the flag down, and students were honored, 2 students, one pulling the flag down, the other with folding it properly. So along with being an Eagle Scout, I grew up with that ethos and very powerfully respond to the power of symbol, including the flag, patriotic songs, all that. However, in the last several years, it does coincide with Trump, but I don't think this is about Trump, Republicans, or Democrats. I think it precedes it in very deep ways, which has to do with the breakdown of moral language, which Trump has managed to harvest in ways that now are manifest in these black-white splits. So to me, it's going back to the question of how is the gap between the symbol and what the symbol stands for, how is that concretized as a shared basis in an overarching narrative that actually is inclusive of everyone and recognizes, and this is where the false consciousness comes in, that from the beginning, the Constitution itself is flawed. The preamble, which is so evocative, presupposes a combination of secular language and sacred language. So bringing sacred language in responsibly to a public sphere that is fundamentally secular, that is at the heart of this. So I think that we really have to recognize that self-criticism is the key. I mean, I think you're completely right. How to criticize oneself is not so simple, especially when you move from the individual to the collective. And even in the case of individual, how many of us can honestly say, oh yes, I criticize my most fundamental assumptions at breakfast? I mean, it's difficult. The religious traditions, certainly Catholicism, Judaism, and I think Islam, I don't know, have built into them as central tenets to which they give language and articulation and ritual language as well. What does it mean to criticize? It's central to being human. When you move to a collective, which is a complex of cultures, diversity of all levels and everything, not so simple, and back to language, as George Steiner pointed out, years ago, a master of language, of course, and culture. When you look at how language deteriorates, becomes attenuated in a culture, it's indicating the breakdown of the culture, the politics, and it's moving in the direction of tyranny. And tyranny reinforces that and dumbs down language. Well, this has started a long time ago. Habits of the heart, I mean, looking at language and the howling out of rich language that operates on different levels of discourse. Kiko, you pointed out years ago about the soundbite and what that might do to public discourse. So what I'm thinking, and I'll end on this, I see things from the point of view of an educator, just because that's who I am. And it's limited just like any other social role is social that has political implications is limited. So I think we've got to go back to the most basic question of how do we educate for political the relationship between the public square and the deeper question of language, and how that ought to include moving into the richness of religious traditions that can talk with more nuance about words that I've heard in this conversation. The sacred, that which transcends differences at a sacred level. Atonement, sin, these are religious words. And so the liberals, I'm a liberal. That's why I'm now actually looking at some of the most basic assumptions I've had as a liberal. But I'm not only a liberal. And I think thinking in terms of political language, just narrow political language, is inadequate. And I think the liberals have done a very poor job of self-criticism of their own assumptions, particularly in the question of demythologizing. Great job of demythologizing. What you've done, what we've done, you and we basically moved the discourse down from rich political nuanced discourse that you can find in the great philosophies and religious traditions, and reduced it to economic language, reductionist economic language, transactional languages of all sorts. This is being supercharged, of course, by the hegemony of the languages of STEM, economics, as Michael pointed out in What Money Can't Buy, how economics has basically taken over the language of the public square, of psychology, of everything, that hegemony, that's got to be broken down. We've got to return to a very, very powerful recreation of what the humanities mean, what liberal arts means, which was always arts and scientists in terms of what are the different discourses within language and how they can be brought together effectively in the public square, what discourses don't belong in the public square.
Bernie's point, I think that's a great one about this politics, this rich political discourse. I think that's the aim of both liberalism and progressivism. And I think that it's sort of the ideally, and we may have strayed from this, ideally we define our politics, the liberalism and progressivism, based on that. It's a politics of persuasion, almost a populism based on meaning. It's like you actually come to a certain agreement about your values, and that's through negotiation. Whereas I think, I loved Jim's point about the flag as idolatry, because I think so often these symbols, like the flag, like the red hat that Trump wears and his followers wear, this is it's a mechanism by which you get belonging without that nuanced discourse, without even discussion or negotiation. So that's sort of this populism through magic, and that's what idolatry is. So I think it's very difficult for me to imagine how we could use a flag, which I think often is it's just part of this magical repertoire by which you get masses to come together for a certain purpose. And I think that's, as Ricardo's saying, this is why it leads to fascism. You so often see flags associated with fascism. So I don't think we can reclaim the flag, except if we want to. I like the idea of flying it as a way to diminish the power of the right-wing people, as a way to troll them. I think it's, definitely put it on your porch if you want to diminish their power, infiltrate them, do that, confuse them, take it away as a symbol. Because if you take away the symbol, the power of the symbol as being associated with that group, as Gwen's saying, the sort of the tribalism of it, then you start to smash the idol. So I think do it as a way to smash the idol, but don't fall victim, as Jim's warning too, to this potential powerful thing. It is an idol. And I think we can't use the flag at all outside of this trolling unless we sort of do the self-criticism, which as other, like Erica and others were saying, it's related to this atonement and required of true patriotism, and that Jim was so eloquently describing. And I think this has to come within both the individual and the collective. And Jim said, I myself experienced the division. I love that idea, and Bernie's calling for us to take it at the individual level of self-criticism. It reminds me just of this June Jordan poem, Do You Do Well to Be Angry, where she goes through, this is written right after 9/11, she says, throughout this long poem, I am an American, but then talking about all these atrocities that have been done by the United States, but she ends, her penultimate line is sometimes, I am the terrorist, I must disarm. So these are some of the thoughts floating through my head, but I think it would be worth this moving away from our discussion of the flag to really talk about how do we go about this proper form of patriotism that has to do with atonement.
Kiku, before you turn to Nicholas and Carol, could I just throw out one provocative explanation that we've not considered yet?
Good, yes.
We've been discussing why the right has been able to appropriate the flag and the symbols of patriotism, and why Democrats don't fly the flag. And we've considered that, well, maybe it's because Democrats believe in a more self-critical kind of patriotism, or maybe because liberals have a demythologizing imagination. There is another possible explanation as to why Democrats haven't flown the flag or reappropriated the symbols of patriotism. And that is, and I just want to throw it out there to see what people think, it could be that Democrats and liberals are less patriotic than Republicans. A survey was done shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Americans were asked if we were in the same position as the Ukrainians are now, invaded by Russia, would you stay and fight, or would you leave the country? The majority of Americans said they would stay and fight. But among Republicans overwhelmingly, by more than 2-to-1, said they would stay and fight. Independents, the vast majority, said they would stay and fight, while the majority of Democrats said they would leave the country. Is it possible that Democrats are less patriotic than Republicans?
I'll put you right on the hot seat. What do you think is the answer?
No, well, let's turn. Carol's been waiting. I want to hear what Carol and Kiku Adado say about that.
Well, how about, I don't know, Carol may have made another point, but I definitely want to hear what Jim says. Carol, and then Nicholas, and then we'll go back to Jim, because that's a great question. Carol, unmute and talk to us.
I keep thinking about some things that Erica and Felix said. The point Erica made about how now seeing flags flying in Georgia can actually invoke fear, and I really understand where that's coming from, and I think it's really sad that our society has brought us to that point where you feel fear. I don't feel that fear myself, but I have a different circumstance, right? And I think also about what Felix said, where he said that, you know, these flags are now being used basically as just signposting. And he was talking about the World Cup and how he said that as an exception, actually, during this time of sport, you're actually seeing the flags fly a lot more. And so I was just trying to reflect on everyone's comments on, well, what is that line between flying a flag because you are really proud of saying my country is actually supreme versus other countries, and my country actually is dominant. We proudly fly it during times like the World Cup or the Olympics, but not when, you know, our country is going to war. And I mean, I think ultimately it's just about power and violence, because when it's sport, right? It's the reason it's so acceptable is because it's just sport. But you're not assaulting the dignity or the actual life of other beings. And when you're going to war, or when you're flying the flag because you're trying to preserve the kind of nation that we were at a certain time when there was a certain skin color or class that was oppressive against another. And if that's why you're flying the flag, that's also oppression. And so to me, that's that line that gets crossed, right? If we're just flying the flag because we're demonstrating pride and we are trying to say, hey, we think our country is better. We think that we have better ideals. We think that our performance is better. And if it's that, I good-naturedly will sign up to fly that flag. But when it represents oppression, physical or psychological, that to me is why I don't fly the flag today, and why I said I would, but next to a Black Lives Matter flag. On your question, Michael, about why it is that are liberals less patriotic, I don't think so, because I personally just have a fundamental opposition to killing other people, and that's why I don't believe in war broadly. That's why if somebody were to invade, the easy answer for me is probably to get up and leave and take my family, because I have just my fundamental ideals and my disposition, my upbringing, my everything that I believe in is against that. And that's why, to me, when the flag is flown in a way that is so closely tied with violence, whether physical or psychological against others, that's the line that gets crossed for me.
Powerful point, Carol. Let's go on to Nicholas.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody. I think this is one of the most fascinating meetings and most interesting that I have been to in maybe all my life. And I want to thank Sergio also. I think he left already, but for letting me know about the meeting. I think I agree and I follow what everybody has said. I want to add up just a couple of things which I think have also been said by other people in the meeting. I'm also Spanish, and I agree with what Ricardo said about the Spanish case. And I was also quite, I found it very interesting to observe how lots of what has been explained in regards to the reactions about the American flag in the American political and social debate right now resemble what happened in Spain, although our histories are quite different in this regard. I would say that in Spain, it's true that the Spanish flag has been appropriated by many in the right as a nationalist symbol, and it's a symbol that it's filled as exclusionary by a lot of people. If I make, for example, a survey, my father, for example, who's very right-wing, he would be very proud to wear or to visibilize the Spanish flag, whereas I think none of my friends would be willing to do so because they feel it's a symbol which has a lot of charged meaning that they would not agree with. I consider myself a patriot, and I'm also a civil servant. I'm a diplomat. So of course I have a special relationship with this issue, with this symbol, because I would want to believe, and I want also to have a national symbol which is being able to be shared by everybody. And I think this should be the case in a modern democracy. It is an ideal that we should work for. And nevertheless, we find that both in Spain, in the US, in Germany, for example, many other countries, this is a symbolic issue of representation of a democratic community is actually fractured and complicated. I think there's been so many things that have been shared. Kiko talked about the sense of a deeper community. And I underlined this as something very, very important, because I think it points to somewhere that goes beyond rationality. It goes to the unconsciousness. It reminds me of the collective unconsciousness that Jung talked about, and the archetypes. And therefore it has an element of reason, but also an element of unconsciousness, of passions, of feelings. And the other notion that also I wanted to touch on was the notion of fear, which has been shared by Erica and others, and which I totally understand. So it seems to me that a flag as a symbol would be perceived by many as a symbol of oppression, and it raises fear, whereas for others it's a symbol of protection, and it just reduces that level of fear. So we have communities where there's really like a Rorschach test, where different people focus on one of the angles of the symbol. And I think that also, as Sergio said, there's an element of sacredness and in depth, and there should be, or we have to find a way of deliberating into how to make this symbol these symbols, flags, be able to accommodate everybody, understanding that for some it's a symbol of fear, for some it's a symbol of protection. And I wonder whether our current media and social media structure allows for having such a civilized conversation that brings on board all of these different sensibilities to try to rebuild, no? Because if we're talking about this, it has been mentioned, the issue of mythology and demythologization. So maybe we have to combine both the rational and the emotional part in rebuilding a mythology in a deliberative way, and being able to adapt it to the new events and symbolic symptoms. A bit like the symbol of a mandala comes to mind, where you're constantly making a new pattern and you need to have everybody involved in building this mandala. But I wonder whether our current media and social media structures allow for that social deliberation that is necessary to heal, in my opinion, the polarization of societies, including in relation to the symbols that as democracies should bind us together.
I think that the question that the pollsters put about responding to an invasion by the Russians might have been addressed not so much to Republicans and Democrats, but to gun owners and those who do not own guns. And gun owners overwhelmingly would love the chance to get their guns out and shoot them. That's very clear in that response, as far as I'm concerned. If the Democrats said they would be reluctant to go to war, that suggests to me exactly the kind of self-critical and thoughtful response one would hope for. It says nothing about whether once Democrats, like all people, saw their homes and their loved ones threatened by a brutal invading force, it says nothing about what they would have done. And the only other point I'd make, Michael, is that there was, in fact, a Russian invasion of this country. And what did the Republicans do? They welcomed it. 2016, Manafort working for the Russian government, in effect. At Russia's behalf, the Republican Party removed from the platform the plank promising to support Ukrainian democracy, because the Russians wanted it gone. Are the Republicans patriotic? There's the answer to your question. Are the Democrats patriotic? Once it was clear over the last 12 or 24 months that democracy was mortally threatened in this country, what did the Democrats do? What did the patriots do? They, in fact, went to political war and defended democracy, and we saw the results at the election a couple of weeks ago. The Democrats are patriots in exactly, speaking generally, in exactly the way we want patriots to behave. The Republicans, as I've been trying to argue this whole conversation, have betrayed this nation in so many ways we are still counting.
To sum up the discussion, first of all, Jim, I want to thank you for an eloquent opening for our discussion and raising so many profound questions, not only about the meaning of patriotism, but the meaning of the culture wars. To expand it to our understanding today, we're thinking mostly right and left, but as you say, it's really complex. The different sources of conflict and culture wars, that have defined our country and other countries. I think one of the central insights from our discussion prompted by Jim's opening is to look at the deeper form of patriotism, an affirmative form of patriotism, in which dialogue, criticism, a notion of atonement, of seeking justice, those are the key elements of patriotism. And a number of people have pointed out, from Bernie Steinberg talking about dialogue, Aaron Sandell talking about the need to be critical, self-critical, and to find a language, as Nicholas and other people, Gwen, many people have mentioned, to find a language in which we can speak to each other again. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, and we'll reconvene come the new year 2023 with our discussion group, Art, Political Culture, and Civic Life. Take care and have a good new year.